We will now move on to today's presentation on CNSC staff's EA and licensing findings for the proposed Nsdf project. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the Chalk River Laboratories site, where the Nsdf facility is being proposed, is located on unceded Algonquin traditional territory, as well as the traditional and/or treaty territories of the Williams Treaties First Nations and the Métis Nation of Ontario. Please move to slide 2. We'll first begin by introducing ourselves. I've already introduced myself as the moderator of the session, but for those who may have missed it, my name is Nana Kwamina, and I'm the Director of the Environmental Assessment Division of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. I am joined by my colleagues, Nicole Frigo, Environmental Assessment Specialist with the Environmental Assessment Division, and Mohammed Sharif Gassim, Senior Project Officer with the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories Regulatory Program Division. This slide shows the key messages of today's presentation. Based on the regulatory review and assessment of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, or CNL's, proposed near-surface disposal facility, or NSDF project, CNSC staff have determined that the proposed NSDF project is not likely to cause significant environmental effects, taking into account the implementation of all identified environmental assessment regulatory commitments. CNL's license application to construct the NSDF at the Chalk River Laboratories, or CRL site, complies with all applicable regulatory requirements, and the proposed NSDF project is protective of people and the environment, taking into account the implementation of all identified EA regulatory commitments and licensing regulatory actions, and that there will be no new impacts on any potential or established Indigenous and/or treaty rights as a result of the NSDF project. The purpose of this webinar will be to provide a high-level overview of how CNSC staff's assessments were undertaken, staff's findings, and where this information can be found in staff's documentation. The scope of today's webinar will not be to discuss or debate the details of CNSC staff's finding for the proposed NSDF project assessment, as the forum for this is the Commission public hearings. Rather, as part of the Q&A portion of the session, we ask that you keep your questions focused on seeking any clarifications on how CNSC staff's assessments were undertaken and where this information can be found in the documentation. We will begin by providing updates on the Near Surface Disposal Facility project, or NSDF project, and the in situ decommissioning projects, herein referred to as the ISD projects. We will then provide an overview of the purpose of the hearing, followed by a walkthrough of CNSC staff's findings related to the environmental assessment, licensing process, and Indigenous consultation. And then we will move into an overview of the upcoming hearing dates and the process for the proposed NSDF project. This slide situates us in terms of where we are in the fall webinar series that the CNSC is hosting with respect to the NSDF and ISD projects. As you can see, today's webinar is the last in the NSDF ISD fall webinar series. Please note that CNSC staff are currently working towards posting the recordings of both the spring 2021 and the fall 2021, winter 2022 webinar presentations on the CNSC YouTube page. Please visit the CNSC's new NSDF project landing webpage and our social media accounts to stay connected and updated on the regulatory review process for the proposed NSDF project. We will begin with project updates on the NSDF and the 2 ISD projects. First, an update on the NSDF project. CNSC staff's CMD and EA report, which includes staff's findings and recommendations, were made available on the CNSC external website on January 24th, 2022, and they are also available upon request to the registry. The CNSC will hold a two-part public hearing on February 22nd, 2022, and continuing on May 31st, to consider CNL's application for the Nsdf project. Requests to intervene at the second part of the commission hearing must be filed with the commission registry by April 11th, 2022, using the online request form linked on the slide. More information about the commission hearings for the Nsdf project will be provided at the end of the presentation. For the NPD project, in December 2021, CNL submitted a revised draft environmental impact statement, or EIS, and responses to requests for information from federal, provincial, and Indigenous reviewers. The submission was assessed by CNSC staff, and on January 11th, 2022, CNSC staff determined that CNL's submission is not sufficiently complete to proceed with the EIS technical review. CNSC staff expects CNL to perform any additional work, revise their submission, and resubmit the draft EIS, responses to information requests, and any supporting documentation that may have been changed as a result of the revisions. Upon resubmission of the EIS package, CNSC staff will perform a subsequent completeness check. Should the EIS submission be deemed complete at that time, the technical review will commence. For the WR1 project, CNL is expected to submit a revised draft EIS and responses to requests for information from federal, provincial, and Indigenous reviewers for the WR1 in situ decommissioning project in late winter 2022. If the submission passed completeness verification, the revised EIS and responses will undergo a technical review by the federal, provincial, Indigenous review team. I will now turn the presentation over to Nicole Frigo.
Thank you, Nana. We will now move on to providing an overview of the purpose of the hearing for the Nsdf project. CNL's license application was originally submitted to the CNSC in March 2017 and updated in March 2021. In their submission, CNL is requesting that the Commission amend the current Chalk River Laboratories operating license to authorize the construction of the proposed near-surface disposal facility. With respect to this license application, the Commission will need to make an EA decision under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act 2012, or CIA 2012, for which CNSC staff's assessment can be found in the EA report, a licensing decision under the NSCA, for which CNSC staff's assessment can be found in the Commission Member Document, or CMD, and a determination on whether the honor of the Crown has been met in fulfilling CNSC's duty to consult and accommodate obligations, for which CNSC staff's assessment can be found in the CMD, EA report, and rights impact assessments, which are appended to the EA report. In accordance with CIA 2012, the CNSC must render a positive EA decision before a licensing decision under the NSCA can be considered. As the EA and licensing regulatory processes for the Nsdf have the potential to impact Indigenous and/or treaty rights, the duty to consult and accommodate pursuant to Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 is required in order to demonstrate that CNSC has fulfilled the duty to consult and accommodate. The CMD and EA report presents a summary of all consultation conducted by the CNSC and CNL, any issues and concerns, as well as responses to those concerns. The EA report provides further detail of this information, as well as contains the assessment of impacts of the project on Indigenous and/or treaty rights. We will now move on to an overview of CNSC staff's EA findings for the proposed Nsdf project. CNL proposed the Nsdf project to the Commission in 2016 through the submission of a project description. The graphic on this slide illustrates the 6 phases of a CNSC EA under SIA 2012, along with the key public and Indigenous participation opportunities for each step. Phases 1 through 4 for the proposed Nsdf project have been completed, and documents related to each of these steps can be found on the CNSC's external webpage and on the Canadian Impact Assessment Registry, including CNSC staff's EA report. We are now at Phase 5 of the SIA 2012 EA process, the Commission hearing and decision. The next slides will provide a walkthrough of CNSC staff's findings as documented in the EA report for the proposed Nsdf project. The scope of the Nsdf project EA focuses on the assessment of potential environmental effects for the entire life cycle of the project, including construction, operation, decommissioning, closure, and post-closure on areas of federal jurisdiction that are relevant for the EA. CNL's Environmental Impact Statement, or EIS, submission was assessed against the requirements outlined in the SIA 2012, the CNSC's generic guidelines for the preparation of an environmental impact statement and other relevant documentation, regulatory document Reg Doc 2.9.1, Environmental Protection, Environmental Principles, Assessment, and Protection Measures, and regulatory document Reg Doc 3.2.2, Indigenous Engagement. It is important to note that CNSC staff's findings do not represent the Commission's conclusions. The Commission's decision-making will be informed by submissions from CNSC staff, the licensee, as well as Indigenous nations and communities, the public, and any interventions heard during the public hearings. In the EA report, I'll continue, okay. In the EA report, CNSC staff provide a summary of each environmental compartment or valued component analyzed, including identification of potential residual effects. For each of the identified potential residual effects, an environmental compartment or valued component, CNSC staff's technical assessment and findings, as presented in the EA report, were informed by
Nicole,
CNL.
did you want me to take over? And,
for a minute, that would be good.
Yes, okay. Sorry about that, everyone. I will take over from the beginning on this slide. In the EA report, CNSC staff provide a summary of each environmental compartment or value component analyzed, including identification of potential residual effects. For each of the identified potential residual effects of an environmental compartment or valued component, CNSC staff's technical assessment and findings, as presented in the EA report, were informed by CNL's assessment as presented in the EIS and related documentation, views and concerns expressed by Indigenous nations and communities as presented in the Rights Impact Assessment and through consultation activities, expertise and information provided by the federal and provincial authorities, and views and concerns expressed by the public and other interested stakeholders. CNSC staff have heard concerns from the public and Indigenous nations and communities through the outreach and engagement activities carried out throughout the regulatory review process. This slide summarizes the key concerns raised, which include long-term safety of the project, proximity to an important water body, that being the Ottawa River, possible groundwater contamination, waste management and inventory, alignment of the project with international standards, cumulative effects, and use of Indigenous knowledge. In reviewing CNL's responses to intervener comments and concerns, CNSC staff ensured that CNL followed the guidance and met the requirements as outlined in Section 6 of the CNSC's generic EIS guidelines. CNSC staff expected CNL, in accordance with Reg Doc 3.2.1, Public Information and Disclosure, to describe in the EIS the ongoing and proposed participation activities that they undertook for the proposed Nsdf project. CNL was required to engage with the public throughout the EA process and to identify in the EIS how issues and concerns raised by the public have been addressed and the extent to which this information was incorporated into their project design and the EIS. CNL was also required to provide a summary of the key project issues raised and their potential environmental effects, and to also describe any outstanding issues and ways to address them. CNL submitted their public comment disposition table to CNSC staff early in 2021, at which time CNSC staff reviewed CNL's proposed responses to comments to ensure that all responses to key issues and concerns were responded to adequately. CNSC staff also ensured that CNL engaged with those stakeholders to discuss their responses and a proposed path forward. The CNSC's regulatory review process is designed to consider and assess all of the aspects identified in the key issues. To reasonably address concerns raised, CNSC staff use new and adaptive tools to explain and clearly provide information on the regulatory review process and to discuss each of these specific concerns during engagement activities or in response to email inquiries. All participants have been strongly encouraged to participate in the upcoming Part 2 public hearing to express their views to the Commission directly. We will now move on to an overview of the CNSC's Nsdf EA report findings. Please note that the sections provided in brackets on this slide refer to the relevant sections of the EA report. CNSC staff assessed the predicted changes to the environment that could be caused by the project activities, such as effects to the atmospheric environment, water resources, terrestrial environment, geological and hydrogeological environment. These subdivisions of the environment are referred to as environmental compartments. Changes to the environment can generally be understood as changes or effects to non-living components and a pathway between the project or activity and the valued component being affected. Changes to the environment caused by the project activities can lead to effects on valued components. Valued components refer to features that may be affected by a project and that have been identified to be of concern by the proponent, government agencies, Indigenous nations and communities, or the public. For this project, CNSC staff evaluated these predicted effects on living organisms, including humans and human activity. The main categories that were assessed are listed on the slide. For each valued component, CNSC staff assessed whether there is a potential effect due to project activities based on CNL's EIS and supporting documentation. CNL has identified mitigation measures to eliminate, reduce, or control adverse environmental effects. A residual environmental effect is an environmental effect that remains or is predicted to remain after mitigation measures have been implemented. The determination of whether a project is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects relates to the assessment of those residual environmental effects. In the EA report, CNSC staff provide a summary of each environmental compartment or valued component analyzed, including the identification of potential residual effects. For each potential residual effect caused by the proposed Nsdf project, to the environmental compartment or valued component in question, CNSC staff's analysis and findings were informed by CNL's assessment of the effect as presented in the EIS and related documentation, the views and concerns expressed by Indigenous nations and communities as presented in the rights impact assessments and through consultation activities, the expertise and information provided by federal and provincial authorities, including Environment and Climate Change Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Health Canada, and the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, and the views and concerns expressed by the public and other interested stakeholders. CNSC staff assessed the likelihood of the Nsdf project to cause significant adverse environmental effects following the application of mitigation measures in accordance with the CNSC's generic guidelines, CNSC Reg Doc 2.9.1, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency's, now the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada's, operational policy statement determining whether a designated project is likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects under SIA 2012. Based on CNSC staff's evaluation of CNL's submissions, the Nsdf project is not likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects to human health or the environment, taking into account the proposed mitigation and follow-up program measures. Should the Commission issue a positive EA decision, CNL will then be required to further design and implement an EA follow-up monitoring program to verify the accuracy of the EA predictions for the Nsdf project, to determine the effectiveness of the measures taken to mitigate the potential adverse environmental effects of the Nsdf project, and to support the implementation of adaptive management measures to address unanticipated adverse environmental effects. CNSC staff are committed to performing oversight of mitigation and follow-up program measures should the Nsdf project be approved by the Commission. Additionally, members of the public and Indigenous nations and communities will have the opportunity to become involved in the environmental assessment follow-up monitoring program. I will now pass the presentation over to my colleague Mohammed, who will provide an overview of CNSC staff's licensing findings.
Thank you, Nana. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to let you know that I will put the video off during the rest of the webinar to maximize my internet connection. Sorry about that. So the graphic on this slide illustrated the CNSC's process for license applications for the proposed near surface disposal facility project. Step 1 and 2 have been completed, and we are currently at step 3, namely the public hearing. Between steps 3 and 4 of the licensing process, the Commission must make an EA decision for the project. If the Commission grants a favorable EA decision, they will then proceed with the licensing decision. These decisions are presented to the public in a record of decision. The following slides in this section will provide a walkthrough of CNSC staff's licensing findings illustrated in the CMD for the proposed Nsdf project. CNSC staff's licensing assessment considered CNL's license application and supporting documentation, CNL's existing programs, processes and procedures as applicable to the proposed Nsdf, CNL's performance in all 14 safety and control areas or SCAs during the current license period 2018-2020, which are listed on the right side of this slide, and public information, community outreach, and Indigenous engagement activities. CNSC staff assessed the CNL submissions of technical documents and safety assessments against the regulatory requirements of the NSCA, its associated regulations, as well as CNSC regulatory documents. guides and standards for relevant SCAs to the scope of the application. For the proposed Nsdf, the key requirements come directly from the Class 1 Nuclear Facilities Regulations and the General Nuclear Safety and Control Regulations, GNSCR, and as well as other applicable requirements from the NSCA. CNSC staff use the applicable regulatory requirements for the licensing assessment review. At the time of CNL's application, the Waste Regulatory Policy, P290, Managing Radioactive Waste, the CNSC guidance document, G320, Assessing the Long-Term Safety of Radioactive Waste Management, were in use and have since been superseded by Reg Doc 2.11.1, Waste Management, Volume 3, Assessing the Long-Term Safety of Radioactive Waste Management. CNSC staff also considered all applicable International Atomic Energy Agency, IEA, safety standards and guidance documents, and integrated best practice from these documents to complement the Canadian regulatory framework used to assess the Nsdf license application. Based on CNSC staff's general assessment of relevant SCAs to the scope of CNL license application and consideration of past performance, CNSC staff have found that CNL continues to implement and maintain effective programs at the CNL site. These programs ensure that license activities are performed safely and in compliance with the regulatory requirements. CNSC staff also found that CNL's Nsdf specific documents are adequate to properly carry out the proposed Nsdf construction activities in accordance with regulatory requirements. The slide illustrates the components of the Nsdf safety case. The safety case presents scientific, technical, administrative, and managerial arguments and evidence in support of the safety of the facility throughout its lifetime. The safety case is supported by the safety assessment, which is initiated at the inception of the project and must be updated throughout the entire facility life cycle. The Nsdf safety case contains two key components: the safety analysis report for the construction, operation, and closure phases, and the post-closure safety assessment that covers the institutional control and post-institutional control phases. CNSC staff assessed CNL's Nsdf safety case to ensure that it meets regulatory requirements through verification that the engineering and design of the facility follows international best practice, uses proven technology, and is compatible with the site characteristics. Comparing the submission information with relevant standards and criteria, and performing independent calculations to validate the safety arguments presented. The Nsdf Safety Analysis Report analyzes the impact of the Nsdf during construction, operations, and closure phases on workers, people, the environment, and the normal and accident conditions. CNL utilizes systematic hazard analysis methodology that included hazard identification and classification, hazard analysis, failure mode effects and criticality analysis. CNSC staff reviewed CNL's assessment and concluded that the systematic hazard analysis methodology is adequate and meets regulatory requirements. The post-closure safety assessment, PCSA, provides an evaluation of the potential impact of the disposal facility on people and the environment during the post-closure period. The PCSA analyzes the expected evolution and degradation of the facility and the impact of disruptive events, such as earthquakes, erosion, climate change, extreme precipitation, etc., on the ability of the facility to isolate and contain the waste. CNL's PCSA, through the use of mathematical modeling, analyze a variety of scenarios: normal evolution, disruptive events, the events such as earthquakes, fires, floods, human intrusion, other waste, case, other worst case scenarios such as the what if scenarios, mass excavation, flooding, etc. Cnsc staff verified and determined that the Nsdf post-closure safety assessment meets Canadian regulatory requirements and aligns with international guidance and best practices. Cnsc staff assessed both the methodology and the results and found that the results provide assurance that long-term impacts from the Nscf will comply with regulatory acceptance criteria, 1 millisievert per year. The Nscf design will ensure containment and isolation of the waste in the near and long term. I will now pass the presentation back to my colleague, Nicole, who will provide an overview of Indigenous consultation activities.
Thank you, Mohammed. The Nsdf project is located or has the potential to impact the traditional and treaty, sorry, my video wasn't started. I'll start over. The Nsdf project is located within or has the potential to impact the traditional and treaty territories and homelands of many Indigenous nations and communities. Therefore, as listed on the slide, the following Indigenous nations, communities, and organizations were identified for consultation and engagement. Starting in 2016, with the commencement of the regulatory review process, CNSC staff provided multiple opportunities for dialogue and collaboration with Indigenous nations and communities about their concerns and areas of focus through multiple phone calls, correspondence, open houses, community meetings, and meetings with leadership and community representatives. CNSC staff provided regular updates to interested Indigenous nations and communities to keep them informed of key developments and to solicit their feedback and perspectives on the proposed Nsdf project, as well as the regulatory review and consultation processes. In the written correspondence and meetings with Indigenous nations and communities, CNSC notified and encouraged the identified Indigenous nations and communities to participate in the general opportunities to provide comments or views on the project description, environmental impact statement, the environmental assessment report and commission member document, and to participate in the public commission hearings. CNSC staff also monitored and verified CNL's engagement with Indigenous nations and communities to ensure it met the requirements of Reg Doc 3.2.2 and other related guidance. In addition, CNSC staff provided the opportunity to interested identified Indigenous nations and communities to develop a mutually agreeable approach to consultation that suited their needs, capacity, and level of interest. As part of the CNSC's duty to consult for the CIA 2012 and NSCA decisions for the project, CNSC staff considered and assessed the Nsdf project's potential impacts on Indigenous and/or treaty rights, which culminated in Rights Impact Assessments, or RIAs, for the listed Indigenous nations and communities. CNSC staff offered to develop collaborative consultation approaches for the RIAs for each of these identified Indigenous nations and communities. The Algonquins of Ontario, Algonquins of Pikwakanagan First Nation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario worked collaboratively with CNSC staff to draft the RIAs and input into the EA report. Views of these Indigenous nations and communities are seen throughout both reports, and CNSC staff have worked with each nation and community to ensure their concerns were appropriately characterized, responded to, and addressed to the greatest extent possible. CNSC staff would like to emphasize that each Indigenous nation and community's Indigenous and/or treaty rights, interests, and concerns are unique. While this presentation provides a summary of the findings of the Rights Impact Assessment processes completed for the project, it is important to note that individual RIAs were conducted for each Indigenous nation and community, and it is important to review each one in detail to understand each nation and community's specific rights, history, culture, and concerns as it relates to the project. In conducting all of the rights impact assessments, CNSC staff, in consultation with potentially impacted Indigenous nations and communities, determined that the project has the potential to impact the following categories of Indigenous and/or treaty rights: harvesting rights, governance and stewardship rights, and cultural continuity rights. Indigenous nations and communities raised concerns with respect to the Nsdf project's potential to permanently remove access to part of their traditional territories, to impact the quality and quantity of harvesting, to alter access or impact sites of cultural and spiritual importance, and lead to fear and avoidance behaviors of their community members and citizens in the area around the Nsdf site due to perceived risk of contamination and impacts on the sensory experience. As part of the rights impact assessment process, CNSC staff also identified and assessed the potential effectiveness and meaningfulness of proposed mitigation measures and commitments from CNL, AECL, and CNSC staff to address the identified potential impacts on the exercise of Indigenous and/or treaty rights as the result of the Nsdf project. CNSC staff concluded that these proposed measures would be adequate to effectively address and mitigate the identified impacts. CNSC staff have found that the potential impacts of the proposed Nsdf project on Indigenous and/or treaty rights have been adequately identified and appropriately mitigated to the greatest extent possible. This slide provides a brief summary of CNSC staff's findings for the proposed Nsdf project, as well as where to look to find more information on CNSC staff's assessments. I will now pass the presentation back to our moderator, Nana Kwamina, to provide a brief overview of the upcoming Nsdf Commission hearing and how to get involved.
As mentioned previously, the CNSC will hold a two-part public hearing to consider CNL's application for the construction of the proposed Nsdf project. Part 1 of the hearing is scheduled to take place on February 22nd, 2022. CNSC staff will present their EA and licensing findings from the review of CNL's license application. The proponent, CNL, will also present their proposal on why they believe that they can safely construct the Nsdf. Part 2 is scheduled to begin on May 31st, 2022. The duration will depend on the number of interventions received. Members of the public, Indigenous nations and communities, and stakeholders are encouraged to submit interventions to have their views and concerns heard by the Commission. Participant funding has previously been offered to help facilitate participation in this public hearing. The Commission hearings will be broadcast live on the CNSC's website, and a recording will be archived for a period of 6 months following the Commission hearings. This recording will be accessible to anyone at any time during those 6 months. A notice of public hearing for the project was issued on October 28, 2021. The notice of public hearing contains all of the relevant information for interveners, including the submission deadlines and the CNSC registry contact information. Please note that all requests to intervene must be filed no later than April 11th, 2022. In order to intervene, you must submit your intervention using the Public Commission Hearing Request form, which can be accessed via the link on this slide. We encourage you to listen in on Part 1, scheduled for February 22nd, and to learn more about CNL's proposal and CNSC staff's findings and recommendations for the proposed Nsdf project. This concludes our presentation.